The land that would one day be known as Zululand lay in the rolling hills and fertile plains of southeastern Africa, between the Drakensberg Mountains and the warm waters of the Indian Ocean. It was a land of rivers and grasslands, of scattered homesteads where people lived in small, tightly knit clans. In the late 18th century, long before the world would speak the name of Shaka, the Zulu were one of many minor chiefdoms in this vast mosaic of Nguni-speaking peoples. They were small, perhaps numbering only a few hundred, and their significance was slight compared to their neighbors, the Mthethwa, the Ndwandwe, and the Qwabe. Yet in this soil of obscurity, the seeds of greatness had been planted. Life in these chiefdoms revolved around cattle, the measure of wealth and status, the symbol of power and survival. Cattle provided milk, meat, and hides, and they were exchanged as bride wealth in marriage contracts that bound families and clans together. Political authority was rooted in kinship, and chiefs were both rulers and custodians of the land, balancing diplomacy with displays of force when necessary. Yet as the population of the region grew and the competition for grazing lands increased, tensions began to simmer. Raids between rival chiefdoms were common, though they were usually small-scale affairs, brief clashes over cattle or disputed territories. The warfare of this time was more symbolic than destructive, fought with light spears thrown from a distance, designed more to demonstrate bravery than to annihilate an enemy. It was a fragile balance, one that could not endure the pressures that were building in the land. Into this world, around the year 1787, a child named Shaka was born. His father was Senzingakona, a minor Zulu chief, and his mother was Nandi, a woman of the Langeni people. Their union was not blessed by proper ceremony, and when Nandi became pregnant, scandal erupted. Shaka's birth was marked by shame, and from the beginning his life was shaped by rejection. His father cast him aside, and Nandi with her son was forced to leave the Zulu kraal, wandering from one place to another, often dependent on the kindness of distant relatives or strangers. For Shaka, childhood was a crucible of hardship. He grew up ridiculed and bullied, mocked as the child of an improper union. His only comfort came from the fierce love of his mother, who instilled in him resilience, pride, and an unyielding determination to prove his worth. As he grew, Shaka's stature began to match his spirit. He was tall, powerful, and keenly intelligent. He entered the service of the Mthethwa chief Dingiswayo, whose confederation was the most powerful in the region at the time. Under Dingiswayo, Shaka found both protection and opportunity. The Mthethwa were expanding, uniting smaller chiefdoms under their authority, and Dingiswayo was an innovator in leadership, emphasizing loyalty, discipline, and centralized authority in ways that were rare among the fractured polities of the land. It was here that Shaka first began to refine the skills that would later make him a legend. But before Shaka could rise, the land itself had to be reshaped. The late 18th and early 19th centuries were times of crisis in southern Africa. Population growth pressed hard on the limits of arable land. Drought struck periodically, devastating harvests and thinning herds of cattle. Rivalries between chiefdoms grew sharper, and the competition for resources became increasingly violent. The old patterns of raiding and symbolic conflict were no longer sufficient. Leaders who adapted to these pressures, who could marshal greater discipline and organization, thrived, while those who clung to the past risked extinction. In this environment, change was inevitable. Warfare became more brutal, more destructive, and more decisive. The traditional light-throwing spear, the assegai, was still in use, but battles were becoming less like games of bravery and more like struggles for survival. Chiefdoms that once numbered a few hundred people were growing into larger polities, absorbing neighbors through force or alliance. The political landscape of the region was being redrawn, and the Zulu, though still a minor clan, were caught in the current of transformation. For the young Shaka, these shifts were both opportunity and challenge. His life in exile gave him a perspective that others lacked. He saw the weaknesses of the old ways, the vulnerability of clans divided by pride and custom. Under Dingiswayo's tutelage, he observed the strength that came from unity, from discipline, from a leader who commanded absolute loyalty. He began to envision a different kind of power, one not tied to tradition alone but forged through innovation and fearlessness. As the 19th century dawned, the stage was set for upheaval. The Ndwandwe under Zwaide were rising as fierce rivals to the Mthethwa, and the clashes between these powers would soon engulf the region in violence. For the Zulu, small and scattered, survival depended on choosing allies wisely. For Shaka, survival depended on proving himself in battle, on showing that he was more than the outcast son of a disgraced union. Each raid, each skirmish, each test of loyalty hardened him, sharpening his instincts and deepening his hunger for greatness. No one could have foreseen then how far this hunger would take him. The hills and rivers of Zululand had seen many chiefs rise and fall, many wars fought and forgotten. Yet within this overlooked land, destiny was preparing to strike. A boy who had been mocked and cast aside would soon become the architect of a kingdom. His story was still only beginning, but already the ground trembled beneath his steps. For the clans of southern Africa, the time of small wars and scattered peoples was ending. A storm was gathering, and at its center was Shaka. This was not simply the story of a man but of a transformation. Out of the fragmentation of chiefdoms, a new kind of state would emerge. Out of hardship and humiliation, a new kind of leader would rise. And out of Zululand, once a name of little consequence, would come a kingdom that would shake the world. The story of Shaka Zulu's rise to power is not only a tale of military genius, but also of unrelenting determination, a will that refused to be broken even when circumstances seemed insurmountable. By the time Shaka reached adulthood, he had already endured the kind of hardships that would have destroyed weaker spirits. He had been ridiculed as a child, driven from his father's kraal, and forced to wander with his mother in search of shelter. Yet in every insult and every rejection, he found fuel for his resolve. The boy who had been cast aside now dreamed of a destiny far greater than any could imagine. Shaka entered manhood at a time when the land was being torn apart by conflict. The Mthethwa under Dingiswayo were expanding, clashing with the Ndwandwe led by the ruthless Zwaide. Smaller clans were being forced to choose sides or risk being swallowed whole. Into this shifting world, Shaka found his place as a warrior in Dingiswayo's army. It was here that his strength, discipline, and brilliance in combat began to shine. He was not merely another fighter in the ranks. He stood out for his fearlessness, his sharp mind, and his ability to see beyond the limits of tradition. The young Zulu warrior quickly made a name for himself, not only for his prowess in battle but also for his unorthodox ideas. Shaka saw flaws in the way warfare was conducted. For centuries, battles had been fought with the throwing spear, where warriors hurled their weapons from a distance and then retreated. Victories were often indecisive, raids more about prestige than conquest. To Shaka, this was a waste of effort and courage. He began experimenting with a new kind of weapon, a short stabbing spear with a broad blade, the Iklua, named after the sound it made when pulled from a wound. Unlike the throwing assegai, the Iklua forced warriors into close combat, where bravery and skill decided the outcome. Shaka's introduction of the Iklua was revolutionary, but it was only one part of his vision. He also reshaped the way warriors fought. Instead of loose skirmishes where men charged at will, he imposed iron discipline, drilling his regiments to move as one. He devised the now famous Buffalo Horns formation. A central body of warriors held the enemy in place, while flanking forces swept around to encircle them, and reserves waited behind to deliver the final blow. This was not raiding but war as conquest, systematic and decisive. His ideas were radical, but under Dingiswayo they found a place to grow. In the battles between the Mthethwa and their rivals, Shaka's methods proved devastating. He distinguished himself as a commander who brought not just victory but annihilation to the enemy. Word of his tactics spread, and his reputation began to rise beyond the confines of Dingiswayo's kraal. Yet Shaka was not content to serve forever under another man's rule. His eyes were always on the future, and his thoughts often returned to the Zulu, the small, scattered clan from which he had come. Though he had been cast out, they were his people, his heritage and his rightful inheritance. Shaka's opportunity came when his father, Senzingakona, died around 1816. The leadership of the Zulu passed to Sigujana, one of Shaka's half-brothers. But Sigujana's reign was fragile and contested, and with the support of Dingiswayo, Shaka moved swiftly to claim the throne for himself. His challenge was decisive and ruthless. Sigujana was killed, and Shaka assumed the mantle of chief. From that moment, the Zulu ceased to be a minor clan. Under Shaka's command, they would become a rising power. As leader of the Zulu, Shaka wasted no time in reshaping his people according to his vision. He reorganized the age-grade system of military service into a permanent standing army, each regiment distinguished by its shield color and homestead. He demanded absolute loyalty, enforcing discipline with a severity that bordered on cruelty. Cowardice in battle was punished by death, and deserters were executed without hesitation. But those who served him well were rewarded with prestige, cattle, and the honor of belonging to the greatest fighting force the land had ever seen. Shaka also understood the importance of symbolism and unity. He worked tirelessly to instill in the Zulu a sense of pride and collective identity. No longer would they think of themselves as just another clan among many. They were the Zulu nation, destined to dominate. Songs and dances celebrated their victories, rituals reinforced their loyalty, and the image of Shaka as a leader chosen by destiny began to take root. War became the lifeblood of the Zulu under Shaka. He launched campaigns against neighboring clans, absorbing them into his growing state. Some submitted willingly, seeing the futility of resistance. Others resisted fiercely and were crushed. Their survivors folded into Zulu regiments or eliminated to prevent rebellion. Each conquest swelled the ranks of Shaka's army, each victory expanded his territory, and each defeat of an enemy sent shockwaves across the region. Within a few short years, the Zulu had transformed from a marginal clan into the core of a rising kingdom. But Shaka's ambitions were not without opposition. The Ndwandwe under Zwaide remained a powerful threat, and they viewed Shaka's rise with growing alarm. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the foundations of southern Africa. For now, though, Shaka's star was ascending. His military innovations, his ruthless discipline, and his charisma as a leader had combined to create something entirely new, a centralized, militarized state capable of dominating its neighbors. Life under Shaka was both exhilarating and terrifying. His warriors were feared across the land, their regiments drilled to perfection, their spears flashing in the sun as they swept across the hills in unstoppable waves. His people spoke of him with awe, sometimes with fear, always with respect. To defy him was death, but to follow him was to share in the glory of a nation rising from obscurity. Shaka ruled with a vision that left no room for weakness, no space for hesitation. He demanded everything from his people, and he gave them in return a place in history. The transformation he unleashed was unprecedented. What had once been a scattered patchwork of chiefdoms was becoming a consolidated state, bound together by force, loyalty, and the indomitable will of its leader. The Zulu were no longer a minor clan. They were becoming an empire in all but name. Shaka had turned humiliation into triumph, rejection into power, and a fractured land into the beginnings of a kingdom. As the second decade of the 19th century unfolded, whispers of the Zulu spread far beyond their immediate neighbors. Traders, travelers, and enemies alike carried tales of Shaka, the warrior chief who fought with a stabbing spear, whose army moved like a single beast, whose ambition knew no bounds. To some, he was a tyrant. To others, he was a genius. To all, he was a force that could not be ignored. The world of southern Africa was entering a new age, and Shaka Zulu stood at its center. He was no longer the outcast boy mocked by his peers, no longer the mere warrior serving another's cause. He was the king of the Zulu, and his rise was only the beginning. The storms of war were gathering, and soon they would break upon the land with a ferocity unlike anything seen before. The rise of Shaka Zulu was not just the story of one man's ambition, but of a nation forged in the crucible of war. By the late 1810s, the Zulu had already transformed under Shaka's leadership from a minor clan into a formidable power. But what truly set them apart was the war machine he created. Every detail of life, from the upbringing of children to the movements of warriors across the hills, was bent to the singular purpose of strengthening the Zulu state. This was not a society that merely fought wars. It was a society built for war. Shaka understood better than anyone that to command power, he needed more than brave fighters. He needed a disciplined, permanent military force capable of overwhelming any rival. The traditional age-grade system of warriors, where young men served temporarily before marrying and moving on with their lives, was swept aside. In its place, Shaka established a standing army divided into regiments, or amabutho. These regiments lived in separate barracks, away from their families, under constant discipline. They trained relentlessly, marched long distances without food or water to harden their bodies, and drilled in formations until they moved as though they shared a single heartbeat. Each regiment bore a distinct identity, marked by the color of its shields and the patterns of its ornaments. Some were composed of young men eager to prove themselves, others of seasoned veterans whose very presence inspired fear. Shaka controlled their marriages, forbidding them to wed until they had proved themselves in years of service. In this way, he delayed the pull of domestic life and ensured their loyalty remained fixed upon him and the Zulu nation. Marriage became a reward for valor, a prize bestowed only after years of blood and sweat. At the core of this war machine was the Ikwa, the short-stabbing spear Shaka had popularized during his early years. Its use transformed combat. Instead of the old pattern of hurling spears from afar, battles now became close and brutal affairs where warriors had to engage directly with the enemy. The wide blade of the Ikwa was devastating in hand-to-hand fighting, and the massive cowhide shields provided both defense and a means to shove aside opponents. Zulu warriors were taught not just to kill but to dominate, to stand their ground against waves of enemies, and to surge forward in coordinated thrusts that broke through enemy lines. The most famous expression of Shaka's military genius was the buffalo horns formation. He envisioned the army as a living creature, the chest of strong warriors locked in combat at the center, the horns sweeping around to encircle and crush the foe, and the loins or reserves, waiting behind to strike decisively at the critical moment. It was a system of battle that demanded discipline, timing, and unwavering courage. In the hands of the Zulu, it became an unstoppable weapon. Time and again, rival clans found themselves trapped, their fighters surrounded, their retreat cut off, their strength annihilated in merciless waves of stabbing spears. The effects of this transformation rippled outward with terrifying speed. Neighboring chiefdoms that had once dismissed the Zulu as insignificant now faced the reality of a force that could not only defeat them, but erase them from the map. Some submitted, offering tribute and allegiance to avoid destruction. Others resisted and paid the ultimate price. Shaka's conquests absorbed defeated peoples into the Zulu fold, swelling his regiments with new recruits and broadening the base of his kingdom. Each victory expanded his power and spread fear further across the land. But Shaka was not content with mere survival or minor victories. His ambition was to forge a vast and enduring state, and to achieve it, he employed ruthless methods. Entire communities were uprooted, populations displaced, and livestock seized to support his growing army. Those who resisted too fiercely were exterminated, their lands redistributed among loyal regiments. This strategy of destruction and assimilation created both admiration and terror. The Zulu Kingdom was built not only on courage and loyalty, but also on blood and conquest. As Shaka's empire grew, so too did the reach of his reputation. His warriors marched farther afield, striking terror into regions that had never before heard the name Zulu. Villages emptied before them, families fled into the wilderness, and rival chiefs scrambled to form alliances to resist the tide. This era of upheaval became known as the Mfecane, the crushing, or scattering, a period when countless communities were shattered, displaced, or forced into new lands as the shockwaves of Zulu expansion spread across southern Africa. Entire landscapes were reshaped by the movement of people driven from their homes, and the political map of the region was redrawn in ways that would echo for generations. Inside the Zulu Kingdom itself, life became a mixture of pride and severity. The regiments lived under constant vigilance, drilled to perfection, and ready at a moment's notice to march into war. Young men dreamed of the day they would don the cowhide shield and stand shoulder to shoulder with their brothers in the line of battle. Songs of victory echoed across the kraals, dances celebrated the glory of conquest, and the figure of Shaka loomed over all. He was not merely a king. He was a symbol of destiny, the embodiment of Zulu strength and ambition. Yet for all the glory, the demands were immense. Families gave up their sons for years of service. The cost of Shaka's wars weighed heavily on communities, who endured strict discipline and the ever-present fear of punishment. Shaka ruled with a hand that could be both inspiring and cruel, rewarding loyalty with honor and prosperity, but crushing dissent without mercy. His people both revered and feared him, for he was the architect of their rise but also the enforcer of their suffering. By the early 1820s, Shaka's power was unrivaled in the region. The Zulu Kingdom had expanded far beyond its humble origins, becoming the dominant state of southeastern Africa. The defeated were scattered, the absorbed became Zulu, and those who remained independent looked on with a mixture of dread and awe. To his supporters, Shaka was a visionary leader who had given his people a future greater than they could have imagined. To his enemies, he was a terror who destroyed all in his path. To history, he would become both. The war machine he had created was not simply about fighting battles. It was about reshaping society itself. Every aspect of life was tied to the rhythms of war. The regiments were both an army and a political institution, binding together disparate peoples into a single nation under Shaka's command. The economy was driven by cattle captured in raids, the culture infused with the ethos of discipline and conquest, and the identity of the Zulu people forged in the crucible of blood and fire. Shaka had turned the Zulu into more than a clan, more than a kingdom. He had built an empire of warriors, bound not just by kinship but by shared destiny, and led by a king whose vision extended beyond the horizon. The world was beginning to take notice, for the power that had risen in the hills of KwaZulu was not one that could be ignored. And yet, even at the height of his glory, storm clouds gathered on the horizon. For every empire built upon conquest must eventually face those who fear it most, and Shaka's kingdom was no exception. The rise of the Zulu Kingdom inevitably brought it into conflict with its greatest rival, the Ndwandwe. For years, the Ndwandwe had been the dominant force in the region, a powerful polity under the leadership of Zwide Kalanga. They were feared for their military might and their ability to command smaller chiefdoms into submission. To the Ndwandwe, the Zulu were once a minor nuisance, a breakaway group that had grown too bold under the leadership of Shaka. But as the 1810s gave way to the 1820s, the balance of power shifted, and Zwide began to see that the Zulu threat could no longer be ignored. The clash between these two rising powers was inevitable. Both Shaka and Zwide commanded disciplined armies, both had ambitions that stretched beyond their homelands, and both understood that only one could dominate the region. For Shaka, the conflict with the Ndwandwe was not simply about survival. It was the crucible in which his kingdom would prove itself to the world. Victory would secure the Zulus' place as the supreme power in southeastern Africa. Defeat would mean annihilation. The first encounters were brutal. Shaka's warriors, drilled in the use of the Iklua and hardened by endless training, proved their worth against Ndwandwe regiments. Yet the Ndwandwe were formidable opponents, experienced in the tactics of large-scale warfare and bolstered by long-standing alliances. Early clashes saw both sides testing each other, probing for weaknesses and suffering heavy losses. Villages were burned, cattle driven off, and entire communities displaced as the war escalated into a struggle for survival. One of the most critical moments came during the Battle of Cockley Hill around 1818. Shaka, commanding a relatively small force compared to the Ndwandwe army, faced near-certain defeat if he confronted them in open ground. Instead, he turned to strategy. Choosing a hilltop position with limited access to water, he deliberately drew the Ndwandwe into a trap. As the larger Ndwandwe force pressed the attack, Shaka's regiments held firm, conserving their strength while the enemy grew thirsty and disorganized. When the Ndwandwe attempted to fetch water from the river below, Zulu ambushes struck with ferocity, cutting them down. After days of attrition, the Ndwandwe force was broken, and Shaka claimed one of his greatest early victories. The triumph at Cockley Hill became legendary, not only for its outcome, but for the way it demonstrated Shaka's brilliance as a strategist. He had shown that he could outthink as well as outfight his enemies, using terrain, psychology, and patience as weapons just as deadly as spears. It also sent a clear message. The Zulu were no longer a minor clan, but a rising empire capable of defeating even the most powerful foes. Yet the war with the Ndwandwe was far from over. Zwaide remained a dangerous opponent, and in the years that followed, the conflict grew into a series of devastating campaigns. Both sides suffered immense losses as they raided each other's lands, destroying crops, seizing cattle, and displacing populations. The struggle was not confined to the battlefield. It tore through the very fabric of society, scattering entire communities across the region in what became one of the darkest chapters of the Mfecane. Eventually, the conflict culminated in another decisive showdown. Shaka, having consolidated his hold over newly conquered territories and expanded his army, prepared for the final confrontation with the Ndwandwe. The Zulu regiments, disciplined and drilled to perfection, faced their enemy with a confidence born of years of victories. At the Battle of Mfecane River in 1820, the two forces clashed in a contest that would decide the fate of the region. The Ndwandwe, marching in large numbers, attempted to overwhelm the Zulu with sheer force, but Shaka's buffalo horns formation once again proved devastating. The chest of the Zulu army held firm against the main assault while the horns swept around in a wide arc, encircling the Ndwandwe and cutting off their escape. Panic set in as the Ndwandwe realized they were trapped, and what followed was a slaughter. Thousands were killed, and those who survived were scattered into exile. Zwaide's power was broken, his once mighty kingdom shattered beyond repair. For Shaka, the victory was more than just a military triumph. It was the moment when the Zulu emerged as the undisputed power of southeastern Africa. With the Ndwandwe destroyed, there was no rival left strong enough to challenge him. The conquered were absorbed into the Zulu fold, their warriors conscripted into regiments, their lands incorporated into the growing kingdom. Shaka's rule now extended across vast territories, his authority unquestioned, his reputation as a military genius firmly established. But with great power came new challenges. The destruction of the Ndwandwe unleashed waves of displacement across southern Africa. Refugees fled in all directions, scattering into the interior and beyond, seeking new lands to settle and new leaders to follow. Some formed new states, carrying with them the military innovations and discipline inspired by the Zulu. Others joined existing polities, altering the balance of power across the region. The Mfecane, already underway, now reached its peak, reshaping southern Africa in ways that would resonate for decades. Within the Zulu Kingdom itself, the consolidation of power was both an opportunity and a burden. Shaka's victories had made him a legend, but they also placed immense demands on his people. The constant warfare required endless resources, cattle to feed the regiments, grain to sustain the population, and men to fill the ranks. The kingdom became a tightly controlled machine, with Shaka at its center, directing every aspect of life to ensure the survival and strength of his empire. The loyalty of his warriors was maintained through strict discipline and the promise of rewards. Success in battle brought honor, cattle, and the right to marry. Failure brought shame, punishment, or death. Shaka ruled through fear as much as admiration, ensuring that no one could challenge his authority. Yet beneath the surface, the strains were evident. Communities groaned under the weight of his demands, and whispers of discontent began to stir. Still, for the moment, Shaka's star shone brightly. His kingdom was secure, his enemies crushed, and his influence extended across the region. Travelers and traders carried stories of the great Zulu king whose warriors marched like a single man, whose strategies confounded entire armies, and whose empire rose from obscurity to dominate a continent. Shaka's name became synonymous with power, and his reign marked a turning point in the history of southern Africa. But Shaka was never satisfied with past victories. His mind turned always to the next challenge, the next conquest, the next opportunity to expand the reach of his kingdom. For him, consolidation was not an end but a foundation, a stepping stone to even greater ambitions. He had destroyed the Ndwandwe, but beyond them lay new territories, new peoples, and new threats waiting to be confronted. The story of the Zulu was far from complete, and the years ahead would bring both glory and tragedy to a kingdom forged in the fire of war. With the Ndwandwe crushed and rival chiefdoms absorbed, Shaka stood at the pinnacle of his power. The Zulu Kingdom was no longer a fragile experiment but a mighty state, stretching across vast swathes of southeastern Africa. Yet victory on the battlefield was only the beginning. To maintain his authority, to transform conquest into stability, Shaka turned inward, shaping his kingdom through a series of reforms that were as revolutionary as his military strategies. These reforms secured his rule, but they also carved out his legacy as a leader both admired and feared, remembered as much for his ruthlessness as for his genius. At the heart of Shaka's rule was the regiment, or Amabutho, system. While the practice of grouping young men into age-based regiments was not entirely new, Shaka expanded and refined it into the very backbone of the state. Every young man of the kingdom was conscripted into service, bound by loyalty to the king, and molded through years of relentless training. Life in the regiment was a crucible. Days were spent drilling, practicing maneuvers, running long distances barefoot across thorn-strewn ground, and learning the art of silent discipline. A Zulu warrior was expected to move as swiftly as the wind, to endure pain without complaint, and to fight with a unity that made the regiment seem less like a collection of men and more like a single living creature. Shaka imposed strict rules on his regiments. Marriage, for instance, was forbidden until a warrior had proven himself in battle. This ensured that the young men remained focused entirely on service to the king, their loyalty unbroken by family ties. Only once they had earned distinction, and Shaka himself had granted permission, could a warrior take a wife and begin a household of his own. Such control over the lives of his people extended beyond the military. It became a hallmark of Shaka's governance, where no aspect of society lay beyond his grasp. The kingdom was organized like a great machine. Villages were carefully positioned to serve as supply points for the army, and strict regulations governed the management of cattle, the lifeblood of Zulu wealth. Shaka introduced a new system of tribute, where conquered chiefdoms were expected to provide warriors, cattle, and grain to support the expanding state. Loyalty was rewarded with protection and prestige. Defiance was met with destruction. It was a system that both enriched the Zulu Kingdom and instilled fear across the region, for everyone knew that Shaka's reach was long and his wrath merciless. Diplomacy, too, played a role in Shaka's rule. He understood that fear alone could not secure lasting power, and so he forged alliances where it suited him, binding neighboring chiefdoms through marriages, negotiations, and exchanges. Yet these alliances were always precarious, built on the recognition that Shaka's favor was conditional and could turn to enmity at the slightest provocation. Even his allies lived under the shadow of his authority, knowing that defiance was tantamount to suicide. As the kingdom grew, Shaka's rule became increasingly autocratic. He trusted few and demanded absolute obedience. Those who betrayed him or failed in their duties were punished with brutal efficiency. Stories abound of executions carried out without hesitation, entire families wiped out to prevent rebellion, and villages burned as warnings to others. Some of these tales were exaggerated by later colonial writers, eager to paint Shaka as a bloodthirsty tyrant. But even with exaggeration stripped away, it is clear that his reign was marked by a climate of fear. Yet it would be a mistake to see Shaka as a leader driven only by cruelty. His vision for the Zulu Kingdom was expansive, and his reforms were often pragmatic responses to the challenges of ruling a fast-growing empire. The regimental system created unity and loyalty. The control over cattle and grain ensured a steady supply of resources. The centralization of power allowed for quick, decisive action. These measures made the Zulu Kingdom not only a military powerhouse, but also a functioning state, capable of sustaining itself in an era of upheaval. Still, the costs of Shaka's ambitions weighed heavily on his people. The demands of constant warfare and rigid discipline left little room for personal freedom. Communities lived under the strain of supplying the armies, of sending their sons to war, of meeting the king's expectations. While some thrived under his system, gaining wealth and honor, others were crushed by its relentless demands. Discontent grew quietly, hidden beneath the surface of outward loyalty, as people whispered of the king's cruelty and dreamed of relief. The personal character of Shaka also played a role in shaping his reign. He was a man of immense charisma, able to inspire absolute devotion in his followers, yet also prone to bouts of suspicion and rage. He demanded respect not only as a leader, but as a figure of near-mystical authority, a man who had risen from obscurity to create an empire through sheer force of will. To his supporters, he was a visionary, a warrior king who had given the Zulu people pride and power. To his enemies, he was a tyrant whose rule was written in blood. In the later years of his reign, Shaka's behavior became increasingly erratic. The death of his mother, Nandi, in 1827 was a devastating blow that unbalanced him. Nandi had been a central figure in his life, a source of strength during his youth and a constant presence during his reign. Her passing plunged Shaka into deep mourning, and in his grief, he imposed harsh restrictions on his people. Planting of crops was forbidden, milk was banned, and expressions of joy were punished by death. Thousands are said to have been executed during this period of mourning, a testament to the extremes of his authority and the fragility of his humanity. These actions eroded the loyalty of even his closest allies. The regiments that once revered him began to grumble, the chiefs who had sworn obedience began to doubt, and within the royal court, whispers of conspiracy grew louder. Shaka's reliance on fear, once a tool of control, now became a source of instability, as those around him realized that their survival depended not on loyalty, but on removing the king himself. Despite these tensions, the kingdom Shaka built was unlike anything that had existed in the region before. His reforms created a centralized state with a formidable military machine, one that commanded respect far beyond its borders. Traders and travelers who encountered the Zulu carried tales of their discipline and power, spreading the legend of Shaka far and wide. To outsiders, he was a figure of awe and terror, a man whose name evoked images of vast armies sweeping across the land with unstoppable force. By 1828, however, the cracks in Shaka's rule had widened into deep fissures. The combination of relentless demands, ruthless punishments, and his increasingly unstable behavior left the kingdom on edge. The same regiments that had once cheered his victories now harbored resentment, and within his own family, plots began to take shape. Shaka's half-brothers, Dingaan and Mfecane, saw an opportunity to seize power, to end the reign of fear and take control of the kingdom for themselves. Thus, as Shaka's reign drew toward its dramatic and violent end, the legacy he had forged stood at a crossroads. He had created a kingdom that would endure long after his death, a state whose military innovations and centralized power reshaped southern Africa. But he had also ruled with a hand so heavy that it crushed the very foundations of loyalty, leaving behind a legacy both admired and feared. To some, he would be remembered as a unifier, a genius, a builder of nations. To others, as a tyrant whose reign was a river of blood. The contradictions of his rule, brilliance and brutality, vision and violence, became the defining features of his legacy. And as the storm of conspiracy gathered within his court, the story of Shaka moved inexorably toward its tragic climax. By 1828, the once unshakable foundations of Shaka's rule had begun to crumble under the weight of his own ambition and grief. The death of his mother, Nandi, had driven him into an emotional spiral, and the extreme measures he imposed on his people in mourning left scars that would not heal. The bans on planting crops, drinking milk, and the merciless executions of those who failed to mourn to his satisfaction created famine, fear, and resentment. Villages that had once sung his praises now murmured in silence, too afraid to speak openly, yet nursing a growing bitterness. Shaka had created a kingdom through discipline and terror, but in his grief he became unpredictable, and unpredictability in a ruler is a poison that corrodes loyalty. Inside his court, the atmosphere grew tense and dangerous. Chiefs who had prospered under his reign now wondered whether their lives would survive his next command. Warriors who had once been proud to fight for him found themselves weary of endless wars and the king's increasingly harsh decrees. Even his inner circle, the men who had stood by him through triumph and bloodshed, began to doubt. Among these disillusioned figures were his half-brothers, Dingaan and Mfecane, ambitious men who had long lived in the shadow of Shaka's brilliance. They had witnessed both his genius and his cruelty, and they had come to believe that his rule threatened not only their own survival but the very future of the kingdom. Whispers of conspiracy turned into plans. Dingaan and Mfecane found allies in those who feared Shaka's wrath and who hoped for a softer hand to guide the Zulu nation. Even Mbafa, one of Shaka's trusted attendants, grew disillusioned and became entangled in the plot. Together, they wove a web of betrayal that would end one of the most extraordinary reigns in African history. The assassination itself is shrouded in both detail and myth, as are so many moments of Shaka's life. One account tells us that on a September day in 1828, while Shaka stood within the confines of his kraal at Kwadukuza, the conspirators struck. Perhaps Shaka suspected nothing, still blinded by his grief, or perhaps he had grown too arrogant to imagine betrayal from within his own family. Dingaan and Mfecane approached him with their warriors, their eyes steady, but their hearts pounding with the knowledge that they were about to challenge a man who had terrified thousands. When the moment came, Mbafa is said to have struck first, plunging his spear into Shaka. The king, once invincible in battle, staggered and cried out in shock and fury. Dingaan and Mfecane followed, their weapons cutting down the brother who had overshadowed them all. The man who had commanded armies, who had crushed kingdoms, who had reshaped the destiny of southern Africa, fell to the ground, betrayed not by foreign invaders or enemies in battle, but by his own blood. Shaka's last words are the stuff of legend. Some accounts claim he cursed his assassins, warning that they would never rule in peace and that the nation he had built would fracture. Others suggest he died in stunned silence, his voice stolen by the shock of betrayal. Whatever he said in those final moments, his death reverberated through the kingdom like a thunderclap. The great elephant, as he was sometimes called, had fallen, and the Zulu nation stood at the edge of an uncertain future. With Shaka dead, Dingaan moved quickly to consolidate power. He declared himself king and sought to present his rule as a new beginning, free from the excesses and madness that had characterized Shaka's later years. For a time, many welcomed this change. The people, exhausted by Shaka's demands and terror, hoped that Dingaan's reign would bring stability and relief. Yet the legacy of Shaka's rule could not be erased so easily. The regimental system remained. The culture of discipline and fear lingered, and the empire he had built was too vast to simply dissolve overnight. Dingaan inherited both the power and the burden of his half-brother's creation, and the challenges he faced were immense. News of Shaka's death spread quickly, carried by traders, travelers, and survivors of his campaigns. Among neighboring chiefdoms, there was a mixture of relief and apprehension. Some rejoiced that the man who had crushed so many stood no more, while others worried about what his absence might mean. For beyond the borders of the Zulu Kingdom, the Mfecane, the great scattering caused by Shaka's conquests, had already reshaped the political map of southern Africa. Whole nations had been uprooted, pushed into new lands, and locked in new conflicts. The death of Shaka did not end this turbulence. It merely shifted its direction, as new powers rose and fell in the vacuum he left behind. In the years that followed, European powers began to make deeper incursions into southern Africa. Traders, missionaries, and settlers pushed further inland, encountering the kingdom Shaka had built. To them, stories of Shakas might loom large, casting a shadow over their dealings with the Zulu. Even in death, his reputation as a fierce and uncompromising leader endured, shaping the way outsiders approached his successors. Colonial observers often exaggerated his brutality to serve their own narratives, but even their embellished tales were rooted in a truth. Shaka had been a man of extraordinary power, capable of transforming an entire region. Shaka's legacy is one of paradoxes. On the one hand, he is remembered as a military genius, a leader who turned a small, fragile clan into a dominant empire through innovation and discipline. His reforms changed the face of warfare in Africa, introducing tactics and organization that made the Zulu army one of the most formidable forces of its time. His unification of disparate chiefdoms created a sense of Zulu identity that persists to this day, binding together people who might otherwise have remained divided. On the other hand, his reign is remembered for its violence and harshness. His reliance on fear and brutality left deep wounds, both within his kingdom and beyond it. Entire communities were destroyed, lives were uprooted, and the trauma of the Mfecane reshaped the cultural and political landscape of southern Africa. To some, Shaka was a visionary leader who gave his people strength and pride. To others, he was a tyrant whose thirst for power left a trail of devastation. These contradictions have ensured that Shaka's name endures in history, not as a figure easily categorized, but as a symbol of both the heights and the horrors of power. He is remembered in songs, in oral traditions, in literature, and in the memory of a people who still speak of his deeds. To this day, his story is told with awe and ambivalence, a reminder of the thin line between genius and cruelty, between leadership and tyranny. In the centuries that followed his death, the Zulu Kingdom would rise again under new leaders, most famously under King Cetshwayo during the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879, when the Zulu defeated the British at Isandlwana in one of the most stunning upsets in colonial warfare. These later victories were possible only because of the foundations Shaka had laid, the discipline and structure of the Zulu military machine that remained long after his death. Even his assassins, Dingaan and Mfecane, who believed they were freeing the kingdom from his grip, could not escape his shadow, for every action they took was shaped by the empire Shaka had built. Shaka's death was not the end of the Zulu story but the beginning of its transformation. He had lit a fire that would continue to burn, sometimes as a beacon, sometimes as a blaze that consumed. His vision of unity, his methods of war, his ability to bend the will of men to his command, all these lived on, even as his body lay buried in an unmarked grave, denied the honor his power might have demanded. The story of Shaka Zulu remains one of history's great epics, a tale of rise and fall, of brilliance and brutality, of a man who carved his place in the world with a spear and reshaped the destiny of nations. His reign may have ended in betrayal, but his legacy endures, etched not only in the memory of the Zulu people, but in the broader history of humanity. For better or worse, he proved that one man's vision could alter the course of history, that power wielded with genius and terror could shake the very foundations of a continent. And though his life ended in blood, his name endures, echoing across time like the sound of warriors' feet pounding the earth in unison.